Once again, you find yourself at the gym overhearing a stupid conversation between two people. Person A says to person B, "Hey man, you really need to try the Paleo Diet. It worked wonders for me and I know it can do the same for you." And person B says to person A, "Well, what even is the Paleo Diet? And I don't know, man. Diets don't seem to work for me." And you sit there and you ask yourself, well, person B brings up a good point. What is the Paleo Diet? Well, because you're a listener of the science behind that, let's talk about the science behind the Paleolithic diet.
Welcome to the Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello everybody and welcome on back to the Science Behind That. I am your host, Atticus Hamilton, and yes, you can tell my voice sounds different. It is really early in the morning here, and so it is still dark outside. I haven't had my coffee yet, so ladies and gentlemen, I just have a glass of water here. So, my voice sounds different because of that. I got that early morning voice going on. But yes, that's right, you heard correctly. We're going to be talking about the Paleo Diet today. Now, I know on this podcast I've talked about, I think it was a keto diet before, and I've also talked about other health-related fads, sort of like both of these two things in the past. The keto diet, or the paleo diet, though, I kind of got the idea for this because I've been seeing it mentioned a lot places. The most ridiculous thing I saw was this person posted on Twitter, I think it was, "I'm already a month into my new keto diet extreme where I don't eat any cooked food." And I'm just like, that is so stupid. Side note, humans developed the ability, once we developed the ability to cook food, our brains increased in overall size and mass by about 20%. So, there's a reason why we cook foods. And we will talk about that a little later on in the episode today. But before we can dive in too much, I invite you to go grab yourself a nice hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it. And in addition to that, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any suggestions, questions, or ideas for the show, you can always drop me a line at thesciencebt@gmail.com. All right, housekeeping out of the way, let's jump right in. So, the Paleo Diet. The Paleo Diet is, well, first we need to talk about what it is. And so basically, it's a diet that's based around the idea that the reason why we have disease in modern society today is because our food is bad. Our food is ultra processed. And since the development of the agricultural revolution, we've just seen massive amounts of chronic disease that have just made us sick and unhealthy. And so the way to rebalance our health is by eating like our ancestors did. And so that's the basic premise. And so what does this actually entail? Well, in general, people who follow the paleo diet don't eat any processed foods. So it's all raw and air quotes natural. I mean, very little of our food these days is actually natural. Unless you hunt it yourself. And even if you grow it yourself, a lot of our seeds these days are genetically modified, which I have no issue with, but I know a lot of people do for some reason. Anyway, so that's the basic premise. So no ultra-processed foods, no fructose, which is good, but they also cut out carbs for some weird reason, and I'll get into that later and why that's actually bad. But yeah, no bread, no rice, no grain, no milk or dairy, which I think is just kind of ironic. It's like, no milk or dairy, yet eggs are okay. It's kind of like, why? And so that's the basic premise. And so it's not vegan, it's not vegetarian, because you're still getting meat. So it's plants and meat, but the type of plants and the type of protein you're getting is highly restrictive. And the reason why is because the paleo diet tries to keep to this idea that you only eat foods that your hunter-gatherer ancestors would have eaten before the development of agriculture, which is why they don't drink milk, right? Because milk, for some reason, they're like, well, milk these days is associated with agriculture, so we can't drink milk. But eggs are fine. And then no grain because that's processed, right? So no bread because that's processed. But again, pretty much anything you eat is going to be processed in some capacity. And no sugar, or no fructose, which I do like there. So that's the overarching premise of the paleo diet. Now we're going to have to talk here about, well, the title, basically, why the paleo diet is BS, because it really is. And I don't say this because it's inherently bad for you, like plant-based meats are. That's not why I'm saying this. I'm saying it's BS because the main things that advocates of the Paleolithic diet argue will result from this aren't because of the diet. And so the biggest thing that advocates of this nutritional regimen advocate is that it will reduce your incidence of chronic illness because our ancestors ate like this and didn't have chronic illness. But the problem with this, I guess, statement is that our ancestors, on average, at least our hunter-gatherer ancestors, didn't really make it past 40. So our hunter-gatherer ancestors would die of acute disease long before they were old enough to be able to develop chronic disease. And so it's not that their non-agrarian diet was preventing the development of chronic diseases. It's just that, hunter-gatherers didn't have doxycycline that they could take when they got a skin-eating infection from a cut. They didn't have antivirals that they could take when they got a viral infection from their neighbor. They didn't have modern surgical tools. So the life expectancy of our hunter-gatherer ancestors was much shorter than the life expectancies today. And so because of it, they never got old enough to experience these chronic diseases. So that's the first issue I take with the paleo diet, is because its premise is this idea that chronic disease results today because our diet is bad. And if we eat like our ancestors did, we won't get chronic disease because they didn't. And look, ladies and gentlemen, diet plays a massive role in the outcome of disease. We've seen that with COVID. One of the leading risk factors for developing severe COVID-19 is obesity. And that is, in 90% of the time, except in instances of lipedema or lymphedema, is tied back to diet. And so diet is very important for progression of disease, but the Paleolithic diet is not the reason why our ancestors did not develop chronic disease. The reason why is they were dying of malaria. They were dying of infected wounds before they could die from chronic disease. So that leads us into the other part of this, which is that cutting out carbohydrates, that's the one that I don't get, because that one's just wild to me. Carbohydrates are extremely important. Now, what isn't extremely important is fructose. So that is one area that the Paleolithic diet does do well, which is eliminating fructose. But the keto diet eliminates fructose, and a pescatarian diet can eliminate fructose. And you don't need to go on a special diet to not eat sugar. So, but that is one good thing that it does, because fructose is the number one cause of elevated LDL levels or bad cholesterol in the blood. And bad cholesterol leads to atherosclerosis, which leads to heart disease and ultimately potentially death. So the limiting of the fructose intake is a good thing. But what isn't a good thing is limiting of all carbohydrate intake on the paleo diet. And that's what I don't understand. Now, the reason why they do this is because grains are a result of agriculture. And again, this diet is trying to emulate what pre-agricultural, pre-agrarian humans would have eaten. And so they eliminate grains. But bread, for example, can be really healthy for you as long as there's no added sugar. And the reason is because these simple carbohydrates are converted to either glucose or glycogen. And both of those energy sources are vital for the body to function properly. And if you cut out carbohydrates, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get those energy sources than it would be otherwise. And so if you're concerned about like sugar intake in bread, just look for bread at the grocery store that has very little or no added sugars. And there are breads out there like that. One in particular is called Izzo sourdough bread if you're in America. And that is fantastic. It has no sugar in it whatsoever, but it is really delicious. And no, I'm not sponsored by them. I just, I like bread, and I really like their bread. And so if you're trying to limit fructose intake, but you really like bread, don't give up bread. Don't give up carbohydrate. Just be more aware of what is in your carbohydrates and what carbohydrates, and what carbohydrates contain fructose and which ones don't. And I think the best place to end this episode is on the one thing that, or on the second thing that the paleo diet does well, because that way we're nice and well-rounded. Number one is that the first bad thing that the paleo diet does is it perpetuates a misconception that this diet will make you really healthy because it made our ancestors healthy, but in reality that's not the case. And the second part is it cuts out carbohydrates when you really need those. The first good thing, of course, was that it limits your sugar intake. And the second good thing is that you get a lot of fiber on the paleo diet. But, ladies and gentlemen, you can just add fiber to your non-paleo diet. And so, basically, where are we concluding with this? Overall, it's probably best not to stick with one diet. Maybe pick and choose things from all over the place. Take the high fiber from paleo and mix that with the high protein from keto, and take high carbohydrate, mix that with high carbohydrate from keto and then high protein from Atkins. Overall, ladies and gentlemen, we need to make sure that we get enough protein, around 60 grams for an adult man per day, and 30 grams for an adult woman per day of protein. We need to make sure we get enough carbohydrates, fats, and glucose, and we need to make sure we limit our fructose intake. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Science Behind That. I will see you guys all on Friday. Have a fantastic week, and remember, stand up and question everything.